Good evening. Good evening. My name is Christine Gordon. I am the Programming Manager for Readings, and on behalf of Monash University Press and of Readings, how delighted I am to have each and every one of you here. Before we get going, before we start a discussion tonight on Bill Bowtell's excellent essay, I want us all to take a moment out of our busy lives, our busy schedules, to reflect that wherever we are in Australia, we are living on stolen ground. It seems to me it doesn't matter where we have come from, that at the moment we are on land that has not been ceded, land that is not owned by us. At the moment I am speaking from the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects on behalf of all of you, and indeed my deep felt gratitude to their elders past, present and emerging. And of course, when I think about everything that the First Nations people have given us, perhaps the greatest gift is their stories and their songlines that allow us to make sense of who we are and where we are. And of course, we have other extraordinary people that live here in Australia that do the very same thing. And of course, by this I'm talking about our scientists, our journalists, our leaders, our thought providers. These are the people that we hear and we listen to and we turn to when we want to make sense of what is happening in our own land and beyond. I'd like to now introduce you to Professor Brendan Crabb, who will be facilitating tonight. Brendan, of course, AC, is a microbiologist. He's the CEO of the Burnet Institute, and we are delighted to have him here. If we were in a theatre, Brendan, the applause at this point would be extraordinary.
Thank you so much, Chris. And just before you all came on air, Chris said to us, "Don't worry, this is Zoom. We know things happen, that wouldn't happen if we were all in person." And of course, just as I was about to be introduced, my dog jumped at the front door and wanted to go out. So apologies for that, but it did exactly happen as you predicted, Chris. Can I begin too by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Wurundjeri people, paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And thank you, Chris, very much for that acknowledgement of our First Nations people just a minute ago. My name is Brendan Crabb. I'm the director of the Burnet Institute. I was actually trying to put up a different background that didn't have the Burnet up there, but I didn't know how to do it at the last minute. But that's not really in a sense, my main job. It's my paid job. It's not the line of work that I know Bill Bowtell in, though. We're very much in Australia and in the world. We're a part of a global health, I was going to say ecosystem, but I guess I mean group that really works together. We all work for a common cause. And I've got to know Bill very well in that. And so this is an enormous pleasure for me, Bill, to host this tonight, and thanks so much for recording your experiences of the last 10 months or so that we're going to talk about in the brilliant short book that we're in a sense launching tonight. I am a scientist, and so I look at those with political capabilities, with policy nous, with advocacy skills, and especially in Bill's case with remarkable communication capacity with absolute awe. And that's a big reason why I've got to know Bill and admire him so much over the last 10 to 15 years, because my world is just so separate from that. It's really stunning. And a great lesson in the different elements that have to come together to make a difference. So tonight I am just going to introduce both Bill and our special guest, Helen Clark, and then I will facilitate a Q&A between the three of us effectively, and we will go on for about 35 minutes or so. And as I said, unfortunately, we're not taking questions tonight, but if there is anything absolutely burning or we've missed or we've mucked up, I would actually like to hear it. So I'll start with the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who, as a saying goes, doesn't need really much introduction. One of New Zealand's most successful and enduring political figures. Prime Minister for 9 years, from 1999 to 2008, a time of incredible progress for New Zealand economically and on the employment front. But also on the policy front in areas that are really special to me. And I must say, from an Australian context, that I look on with quite some envy around sustainable development, especially climate action, reconciliation with First Nations people, and just inclusiveness more generally in a multicultural and what is a fantastic multicultural and multi-faith society. And reflecting on that earlier today, I think the most amazing part, if I might say, is how enduring it is. You know, it's gone from strength to strength, and on the base that you built. So incredible legacy. And then from that period in 2008, I've gone on to do so many incredible things, and I won't mention those. I think everyone will be aware of time as administrator of UNDP. But I do just want to mention one of them, of course, because it's the most recent gig that Helen has as co-chair of the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response, together with Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And it's hard to imagine a trickier and more important job. The mission of this panel is to provide evidence-based paths for the future, grounded in lessons of the present, to ensure countries, and especially WHO, address health threats as a formal way of saying it, but I guess improve, do things better, find out what lessons needed to be learned or could be learned from this time and put into practice. A very, very important and tricky job entrusted only to the most absolutely capable person imaginable. So Helen, thank you so much for joining us this evening, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, of which you would hear wonderful applause. Before asking your question, Helen, I'm going to introduce Bill, and then I will facilitate some Q&A. Now, Bill, I've already alluded to, is somebody that I've known. I met Helen only tonight. I know by reputation, but I've known Bill for many years. The Burnett Institute has been in existence that I run for 35 years. And the year it was born out of an infectious diseases hospital in Victoria, Melbourne, that was closed down, the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital. So it became the Burnett. Was when HIV was 1985, really became clear that here was the first pandemic in quite a while since really the 1918 influenza pandemic. So our institute was born with this HIV catastrophe. And, Bill's life, which is very rich and full of many successes in his role as a diplomat and a policy advisor and political advisor, peak body president, peak body CEO, and extraordinarily successful at so many things, including the introduction of Medicare in Australia, which is of obviously such global significance. But it really was Bill's role in HIV, obviously, that made the most impact on me, but from my perspective, is a legacy for Australia and for the world. And as I think will come across tonight, as such an important and perhaps, at least to me at least, unexpectedly significant lessons from that HIV response in Australia. But effectively what happened was an infectious disease that Bill was not an expert in turned out to have barriers that were bigger than the science of a new infection, barriers of legality, barriers of social acceptance and stigma, gay men, sex workers, injecting drug users. The barriers to address that were enormous. And the response led by Bill and the minister that he was advising, Neil Blewett, and thankfully with broad support across the Australian Parliament and community, was broadly speaking appropriate, breaking down those barriers. And it would not have worked without it. In the US, for example, the response was partially appropriate in that respect. It dealt with, to a reasonable degree, sex workers and gay men, but it left injecting drug users behind. And at the moment, the US has about 1 million HIV positive people, way more, 5 or so times the rate that Australia and other comparable countries have. They left a group behind. And that didn't happen here. Bill, it's a great legacy, and it is something I want to flesh out a bit today. Fast forward 30 years with all those significant things that I've skimmed over, and I'm sorry because I could go on for 40 minutes about what happened between your role in the HIV response in Australia and now. And we have COVID, a respiratory disease. Not obvious that the target population was controversial in any way, the same way that HIV was. So what could possibly go wrong with that? You know, in the same context, that's certainly what I was feeling. It's going to be a complicated new infection, but what could possibly go wrong? Well, Bill, I think you sensed very early on that something was going wrong. Countries that we look to for as trailblazers and leaders in this space were having problems. Countries ranked at the very top of the list of how new infections should be dealt with were having problems. I know that was ringing alarm bells in you really early on, and to a large degree as a private citizen, you got very active. And so, Bill, is a very great pleasure for me. I'll say a couple of words at the end as well about that to do this, but I want to get to the heart, in welcoming you, I want to get to the heart of what it was that twigged that, oh, hell, we might be living this over again, even though on the face of it, it looks completely different. Bill Bowtell.
Thanks so much, Brendan and Chris and Helen. Lovely to be here, and everyone who's logged on. Look, I was very young when I was an advisor to Neil Blewett and saw what happened and what went wrong, and then what went right with HIV. Out of nowhere, seemingly, to the astonishment of just about the entire world, this disease came and started killing and injuring people in Australia and around the world. And it's remarkable to think, but it took months, if not years, to figure out, for science to figure out and advise governments what was actually going on. For many months, people didn't know what it was, and it only became apparent after much strenuous activity it was a virus. And of course, we all know then what happened. But as I try to say in the book, my view formed after the terrible experiences with HIV and AIDS and seeing how it was mismanaged so grotesquely around the world, came down to this. Nature creates viruses, but politicians and bad politics create pandemics, and then out of pandemics you get new politics. And we lived through that, and I know some people are on this call, like Phil Carswell and others, whether they're activists in the community, doctors, scientists, researchers, carers, and very importantly, the people who are most affected by it, how we came together, the science was open and transparent, and bit by bit we fought it back in Australia and around the world. And it really scarified me. I feel still, the deaths of the 7,000 or 8,000 people who died in Australia from HIV, many of whom were my friends. But watching how the politicians of those days in our country came together and did as best they possibly could, and then were supported by the Australian people as they saw what was happening. Well, to me, that was a pretty good model for when the next one came along. And over the years, it has to be said, I think the world learned from HIV that as viruses come from nature all the time, when we had Ebola and Zika and so on and so forth over many years, it seemed that the early warning systems were as good as they could be. These viral threats were dealt with as properly as they should have been, and the crisis passed. We saw that with Ebola, with Marseilleaf in West Africa. Come to COVID, and the whole thing seemed to fall in a heap. It was shocking. People go around saying it was unprecedented and unpredictable. Well, of course it wasn't. Viruses come from nature all the time. So a year ago, the whole world started to repeat the lessons again. It was like every country was a different Petri dish.
So was there a light bulb moment for you, though? I'm going to get to New Zealand in a moment, who we were looking at as impeccable in their response right from the get-go. I was one who had concerns that we were going to head in the wrong direction. As it turns out, we're COVID zero in Australia, and it looks fantastic. But we were very worried at one stage. What was
we averted disaster by the skin of our teeth. It was a year ago in London. I could see that it was going wrong there. They were seemingly embarking on a herd immunity, let it in, let it run strategy, and taking it very calmly, truthfully, in January. And that was not the case in many of the Asian countries around China. They saw it for what it was, for SARS. And I came back to Sydney in February, and I was astonished at the lack of urgency and the lack of getting a grip about prevention. And I thought, well, maybe there's a bit of a lag in the system, and as people understood it, the gravity of things would happen. Well, it didn't happen in Australia in February and into March. The only place it happened was in our region, thankfully, was in New Zealand. They saw it. They saw they had the advantage of time and knowledge and geography, but they resolved very thankfully to keep it out at the border. And we owe them a great deal of thanks for that, the New Zealand.
We do, and it's a great segue to you, Helen. From as you already can glean from Australia's perspective, we just thought you had it right right from the get-go. Is that how it really was? Just the progressive New Zealand that we all love from afar, or did you have your own challenges in those early days?
I think we had our own challenges, but we were quite quick learners. But I think what's been very interesting to look back on is how the month of February, after the World Health Organization did the declaration of public health emergency of international concern, was a month of relative inactivity in the countries of the OECD, broadly speaking. I'll exempt Korea from that because they were on the front foot, having had the SARS experience. But for the most part, I felt that, and our panels made this observation, that the world kind of sat and looked at what was happening in Wuhan as if it wouldn't happen to us. And like Bill, I was in Europe, just before the disease got really serious. I think, Bill, we dodged a bullet ourselves. That virus was circulating far more widely than anybody knew in the January and February period. So back in New Zealand, like Australia, we got smart and we said the flights aren't to come from China. Thank goodness we said that, or things would have been worse. We eventually put a stop to travellers coming from Iran. But our first case turned up on the 28th of February, a confirmed case. And on the 28th of February, the Ministry of Health issued a press statement. And unbelievably, it said, we think the risk of community transmission is very low. Famous last words. Incredible when you look back at it. I'm surprised I could still find the statement on the website, actually. So we kind of blundered on like the rest of the world. But I think when it started to run out of control in Italy, that was a huge wake-up call. And New Zealand, I think, like Australia, other countries, we'd been thinking that the flu pandemic plan was the one to dust off. And one learning that had come out of the 2003 SARS experience was that my government, in the mid of the first decade of the century, passed epidemic preparedness legislation. So we had a sort of architecture there. And pursuant to that, you had the flu pandemic plan. But the New Zealand government, under heavy pressure from very progressive and forward-thinking epidemiologists, eventually worked out that the flu pandemic plan was the wrong plan, that you needed a bespoke solution for this. This wasn't about flattening curves. If you were just trying to flatten the curve of cases, you were going to consign how many thousands to their deaths in our country. So we got smart eventually, but like everyone, I think we were caught napping. Our testing and tracing system wasn't up to it. We kept passively accepting people without, being able to test and trace. And I had an experience like Bill of coming back into New Zealand in the kind of mid-late March period from Chile. When I'd arrived in Chile, I'd had my temperature taken at least 3 times. I got back to New Zealand, was given a public health leaflet, asked if I had any flu-like symptoms, and sent on my way. I mean, it was pathetic. Now, all of that had to change fast. So eventually we got it right and have had a relatively successful response by world standards, as have many of the states of Australia. But it was learning by doing and learning as fast as you could.
It's amazing to me, the political, I mean, now it's seen as a politically great winning strategy. We've just seen Mark McGowan's election in re-election in WA by an amazing landslide as evidence of that. But it must have been such a risky thing at that time and so brave. Do you think, just a question for both of you, but you both speak to enough people internationally all the time, do they look upon these eliminated countries, I mean, inverted commas, of New Zealand and Australia with a sense of weirdness, admiration? Do they think we're crazy? Because I wonder how they live and how governments survive in places where there is a lot of COVID, when countries like New Zealand and Australia have shown it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe we have special circumstances and that's how they excuse it. What's your reading on that, Helen?
Yeah, I think, Brendan, that they make excuses for our position. They say, oh, well, they're islands, they can cut themselves off. Look, you have to make your luck. We could have had pandemics as bad as other countries of the Western world, but we didn't, because a range of decisions were taken to stop that. So we can't just be dismissed like that. Where our solutions have worked well, it's been because basic public health measures have been applied, and they've been applied rigorously. In New Zealand, when the government finally decided that its strategy was to stamp this out, elimination became the strategy. I call it a zero tolerance strategy more than elimination, because you actually, with the transmissible nature of it, it's very hard to stop any leakage ever from the border, and we all know that. But you see it, you stamp it out. Now, what other response would you want to something like this? Someone said to me at a university lecture that I gave about 6 weeks ago, why doesn't the WHO recommend an elimination or zero tolerance strategy? And I said, I assume because they don't think it's practicable. But if that's not the strategy, what is? Otherwise, are you just going to let a pandemic, roll on with now all the complications we see of the variants and not knowing whether the vaccine response is going to be adequate and so on. So I think that Australia and New Zealand could be a bit more vocal about wanting the global strategy to be more explicit about stopping transmission. That's a zero tolerance strategy.
No, and before asking Bill to comment on that, I mean, I've worked on vaccines my whole life, and this time last year I was not super confident. I mean, it's they're tricky things, especially for respiratory pathogens, to make them. They sometimes work, they sometimes don't work. We're lucky we had a lot thrown at it, a lot of different strategies. I wonder what would have happened, this is to you, Bill, as an extension of that same answer, if the vaccines had not been successful. They're a miracle, and we're going to talk about those in a moment. Miracle's the wrong word. There's great scientific achievement, but there's a lot of luck in vaccines. You can't predict whether they're going to work or not. And it turns out they have. But what if they hadn't? And what if the next pandemic is in that category where it's a lot more complicated? Do you think this strategy of elimination is a no-brainer then, Bill?
Yes.
Or zero COVID?
I became a bush epidemiologist, right? I defer to the experts, but one thing we learned very quickly with HIV was that there were behavioural vaccines, if you like, that the virus wasn't an all-conquering zombie from outer space. Very simple things like using condoms, clean needles and syringes, persuading at-risk people to change their behaviours, sexually and otherwise, really worked. It was amazing how quickly they worked when they were implemented. I can remember with needle and syringe exchanges. The moment that was done in Sydney, the rates of new infection amongst injecting drug users disappeared. And we've had virtually none over 40 years, roughly. And again with COVID, we understood, against a great deal of very odd opposition, seems to me, that very simple things, distancing, sanitation, hand washing, and most of all masks, over which there was a theological debate for the last year, but obviously they work very well, and really, really put the virus back in its place. It was a mystery to me why people somehow thought that behavioural change wasn't able to be recommended, because I tell you who understood it was the people.
That's right.
In Australia and New Zealand. And when they were confronted with the idea you could live with COVID in this never land state or get rid of it, well, they very profoundly opted to get rid of it. Now, had there not been vaccines, I think we'd be forced in the world to follow what's been done in Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand and others, to lock down and eliminate it, or as far as is possible, control it in the larger countries. Europe didn't lock down. They went on some holidays. And of course, we saw what happened in the United States. And I mean, who wants that misery and destruction? So it's an interesting hypothetical, but the next one will come along. It's on the way, and we've got to do a lot better the next time than we did with this one.
And it's interesting about whether this one will finish. I'm going to move to vaccines, and an interesting segue from letting it run lots of virus versus vaccines is, from my opinion, the biggest risk right from day one of letting it run was that if you had a vaccine that did work, you were jeopardizing it. And that's still the case. You're jeopardizing it because of the certainty of Darwinian evolution to get immune evasion and fitter viruses. And that's what's happening. So there's an additional, there's the direct humanitarian abomination of letting it run, but also actually jeopardizing the one tool you're relying on. So I'd like to talk about that tool, because as you've already got a sense of, it was a big surprise to me that they worked, and they all worked, and they basically all work well. And then we're left with this thing that certainly I wasn't predicting, and that's choice, vaccine choice, which has become, in this country at least, quite a politicised thing. Helen, is it politicised in New Zealand? Is politicised the right word? Certainly got a great debate amongst our community as to, well, we've got options. Which one should we have? Did our government do the right thing when they were making effectively guesses early on? Have they been asleep at the wheel? I can tell you I'm quite supportive of our government's vaccine program. One of the things they really did get right and were very aggressive about early on. But we had to deal with this choice thing of some being slightly better than others, and real world data coming out. We were living in the real time of clinical trials. How did that go down in New Zealand first, Helen, but also more generally in the world? How's that playing out, this issue of choice?
So I don't think the New Zealand public has been so exercised about, which of the vaccines is it that the New Zealand government has chosen. Uh, Obviously, the Pfizer one has required quite a lot of investment, and I'm sure this would be the case in Australia, because it requires being stored in such a cold temperature that generally the health system just didn't have that at hand. So the government made it clear that it would be making the investments required to be able to procure this vaccine and store it. And so the Pfizer vaccines had quite a profile here. Of course, I guess most people watching this are aware that there's quite a lot of debate now about the AstraZeneca one, with various European countries putting disbursement of it on hold, and who knows how that will play out. But so far so good in there not really being a major public debate about the choice here. I think in general, if the public think that the choice has been made by the experts on this, they have reasonable trust in institutions. If they thought it was a political choice around the cabinet table, then it would generate debate. But as long as they know that there's a proper system of expert evaluation, they're more relaxed. I think the bigger issue here is how big will the anti-vaxxer movement be? How many people will resist having the vaccine? Because frankly, if we can't get around our world very high proportion of people vaccinated, we're going to have this thing with us for, well, the rest of my lifetime and beyond. I mean, we have to get it under control, and the vaccine is a very important tool in this. I also think that there's going to have to be really permanent, ongoing behaviour modification, public health measures, which also helps prepare us for the next time something gets out of the bag like this. And I think what's great about Bill's book is he keeps telling us viruses aren't new. They're one of the oldest things around, right? They're going to keep coming. The question is, can we be smarter than they are? Can we beat them at their own game? And basic public health measures can do a pretty good job of that, complemented by a vaccine. I think our publics want to be free of this. And, for the most part, we'll do what it takes. And I hope that sentiment will enable us to really get the anti-vaxxer numbers down to a point where they're not a threat to the health of others.
No, the vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxer movement's huge. And Bill, here in Australia, this choice of vaccine thing is a hot button issue, and I think sometimes seems to be linked to vaccine safety, which generally hasn't actually been an issue. Of course, it's come up in the news with the thrombosis AstraZeneca link, which is, in my opinion, quite a furphy. But anyway, that's the drama of today. Why here, Bill? Why was it? Have we lost faith in our public institutions or in our politicians? Is that why it's such a hot button issue here?
Look, in the difference between 40 years ago and now in Australia generally is that the public health structures that we built up under HIV deteriorated and atrophied. 98% of the health budgets of Australia go on care and treatment, which of course is very good for people who are being cared and treated for, but virtually nothing goes on public health. Now, public health is about prevention, and it's always got to be brought before the public, whatever you're doing, to prevent illness, to change behaviours, to moderate it. Anti-vaccinations is part of that. Australia went, I think in the 90s, way down in vaccinations, and to the credit of the then Minister Michael Aldridge, he said, this is wrong, it's got to go up. But we've allowed this to fall away, and it's gone far too far in Australia. So one of the big things we have to do is invest billions more in public health, education, outreach, behaviour modification, and being very transparent and open. I'm very critical here in the last year that a large part of what was being done was being put together behind closed doors. There was no transparency. Things were being issued by press release, and then all the rest of us would have to try to determine what was going on and then resolve, thankfully, to change people's minds and opinions. It's not the way to run a railroad in the middle of a global pandemic. All of this should be open, so that the greater the truth, the greater the trust, the greater the transparency, the more truth, the more open discussion and debate with the Australian people, the greater the trust will be. And when you've got trust, you can do a great deal. But without it, you have problems, as we had in Australia. And I think, unfortunately, the silliness of some of the vaccine propositions at the moment relates to the way in which it's been done behind closed doors and the rest of it. People are bright enough to figure out what's in their interests and their families' interests, but they just don't take it on an august person's word anymore.
No, and so if I could just shift to the issue of what I think is one of the big lessons of COVID and a parallel with HIV, that it turns out that more disadvantaged, vulnerable communities were actually the most vulnerable for COVID as well. So you have a respiratory pathogen. The dogma is, well, it goes to everybody. It's, it doesn't make any difference. Well, it turns out it does make a difference. And it obviously made a very big difference in Australia, those with insecure work, those who didn't have a home to go to, and so on and so forth. But I want to shift in the few minutes we have left to talk. I'm going to talk about this and then perhaps the global reform response, about internationally, and especially about vaccine equity that we hear so much about. The poorest countries in the world, as I understand it, still, Helen, are slated for vaccination sort of a year to 18 months or even beyond what vaccination rates will be in more developed countries, with sort of a sliding scale in between. And yet there seems to be some naivety to that on many fronts. And I know that this is a major issue of interest and focus for your attention. What do we do about this issue of getting everybody vaccinated, not just those who can afford it?
Well, it's now the huge issue, I think, in the response. And the concern began, and I certainly put my name to the people's vaccine calls for an equitable rollout. Concern came because of the inequity, that you and I, those watching in New Zealand and Australia, within the next, 2 to 3 months, those of us who are, in the slightly older demographics can expect to get it, and the health vulnerable will get it, and will roll out to the rest of the population before the end of the year. But on the current trends, there's not a hope of that happening in sub-Saharan Africa and other low and low middle income countries. So people said, this just ain't fair. Now, it ain't fair and it's wrong, but there's also another angle to it. And that is that we can't be safe in our little islands of, vaccination privilege if this virus continues to rip around everywhere else, because that is just going to provide more scope for more variants, which will be more challenging. And we're already, I think, there's a reasonable prospect that we're looking at having to have booster vaccinations or revaccination, as we're familiar with the flu vaccine each year. So the longer it runs out of control anywhere in the world, it's a threat to us, the fact that it's so inequitable. Now, the answers, of course, lie in a number of areas. Firstly, the scale of manufacturing production is not big enough at the moment. So, if we were talking a therapeutic like the antiretrovirals, it's, well, I'm not saying it's a simple matter. It is a simpler matter to compulsorily license for production of that. A simpler matter, I'm advised, than it is for people to pick up and begin the manufacturing of these vaccines. So in order for that to happen, yes, you have the debate going on in the WTO TRIPS Council, the Trade Rights and Intellectual Property, with India and South Africa leading the charge on wanting a TRIPS waiver, so that, with a limited term for all the therapeutics and the vaccines associated with the pandemic, so the normal intellectual property rights won't apply. And that's useful, but it's not the whole answer. There has to be a commitment to transferring the knowledge and the technology to be able to do it. We need to scale up production radically. Now, that will also need some solidarity from development partners. And I think here's a challenge for Australia and New Zealand. We've both said that in the vaccines that we've procured, we will have space to allocate to the Pacific. All I can say is we'd better speed up, because others are offering their vaccines now, including ones that haven't been approved by WHO. Countries are going to remember who their long-term friends were, and we need to be faster, in my opinion. That's the feedback I'm getting from the Pacific. Others are knocking at the door with their vaccines. Ours is a promise. Well, you can't bank a promise. So, there's a lot of diplomacy. We talk about vaccine nationalism. There's also vaccine diplomacy, and it is operating right now in the backyard of Australia and New Zealand, and we should be mindful.
And we've found one of the reasons Bill and I have been speaking so much in the last few weeks is sort of the need for speed in Papua New Guinea in particular, who, by all accounts, are going through a major upsurge, and we have to think out of the box to get them vaccinated much faster than the current schedule. My last question to you both, and Helen, I'm going to go to you, and then I'll give Bill the final word. And it's a little, it's unfair of me to focus in on the WHO in your circumstance. I'm not going to do that, but this is not going to be the last pandemic having an increased frequency. There's also other challenges, of course, of facing climate change and its effects on health and society. I know it's incredibly unfair to only give you a minute or two on this, but there's some really big lessons, some guiding principle lessons from the pandemic. Has it been a sort of a dry run for an even bigger climate change challenge, or is there something positive we can grasp at least to help us through the challenges of that we're going to face in the future?
Well, the positive would be if the international community could come around and agree on better ways of dealing with pandemic threats. There was a rather sad day in May last year when the Security Council sort of broke down and couldn't reach consensus on a pretty mild resolution on COVID. And it was on that very day, 40 years before, that smallpox had been declared eradicated. Even at the height of the Cold War, it was possible for countries across that huge divide to come together, determined to eradicate smallpox and achieve it. And we couldn't even get really that degree of agreement on minor resolutions on COVID at the Security Council. Now, the change of government in the United States, of course, matters enormously in this. So there is an opportunity, I think, for countries to be able to work on this as an issue which binds us all together. We hang together or we hang separately. And if you could make progress on this and effective multilateral solutions, then it might augur well for greater cooperation in other spheres as well. If we can't come together to agree on something that's an existential threat to humanity like this, what could we agree on? So the bright light is, better political ambience in the US for this, and I would hope smart diplomacy that can say, okay, we mightn't agree with you on X, Y, and Z and our serious disagreements, but can we work on this together? I think that would be positive.
And Bill, the big lessons from your perspective, we're not over this one yet, of course, so can't just talk about the next, but are we just going to have to keep learning the lessons? I sensed a sense of frustration in reading your book, frustration in you that you were reliving it. And so it's very easy for me to say final word on lessons so that this doesn't happen again. But of course I worry that it might, and you must worry that it might. But over to you.
Above all, we must come to terms with the facts of molecules of carbon dioxide, viruses, we must understand science, and we must base our policy on scientific evidence and truth. For too long, we have tried somehow to politically negotiate with the molecule of carbon dioxide with climate change. Doesn't work. Climate change is a slow motion train wreck, however, but COVID has been a very fast motion train wreck. And countries tried to negotiate in a political way on the nightly news with a virus, and it can't be done. They obey the iron laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. And we've learnt our lesson with COVID. Only through science and applied science can we deal with it, either behaviourally or with vaccines and so on. But it's a subset of what's going on with climate change. We saw in the last couple of days the disastrous sandstorm that not only blanketed Beijing, but most of China. Now, that's the security challenge in the world.
Yeah.
All the nuclear missiles and armies and submarines and all the rest of it can't protect us against climate change, and they couldn't protect us against COVID. So it means there's got to be a lot more coming together around these two existential threats that we face. And that means redirecting money and effort and intellectual resources and imagination to where the threat is greatest, not where it's the least. And we can't deal with it in a political way. It's got to be dealt with in the top way by everybody, about using science to prevail against the threats that are now really engulfing us.
Fantastic way to finish. Thank you so much. Our time is up, and so it just really remains for me to close on that, I think very hopeful note from both of you. Bill, congratulations on the book. It's sad, I think, in a way, that you had to write it, that you went through that experience. I know, as someone who was very close to everything that happened in the pandemic, that a big reason Australia dodged a bullet was you. And so I think that it's not all, everything that everybody sees. Your mentorship of me every day in the last year, pretty much. I doubt we have not spoken most days in some way, shape or form, and of many other people is incredibly valuable, and a gift to the Australian people that they're perhaps not as aware of as they should be. But please, everybody, do read the book. You will sense Bill's frustration, and the main aim is for us to never have to relive this again. To Helen's point about cooperation, to Bill's about science, those elements really must come together for us to face challenges, unfortunately, that will be bigger and more frequent than COVID. We've just got to get used to the fact that this is going to happen, and not think we've dodged a 100-year bullet. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm sorry we didn't have questions that were live, but what an absolute treat to hear from Helen Clark and from Bill Bowtell. Thank you, everybody.